Welcome back. We're reading Thomas Jefferson's The Art of Power. I hope you're having a good quarantine, a good Ramadan. I've been having fun researching things and just nerding out in the video game world and just handling the quarantine how I want to handle it. And I hope all of you are satisfying your mental health and prosperity the best way you can, and no judgment here. Alright, so we are on page 71. Now Jefferson turned his attention from the chambers of Williamsburg to the broad countryside, from the mechanics of legislation to the leadership of a mass movement. Jefferson's role in the adoption and promotion of the day of fasting and prayer resolution illustrated his growing understanding of the importance of engaging the emotions of one's followers. Oh, to engage the emotions of your followers. For Jefferson, the decision to base a revolutionary appeal on religious grounds was expedient. So when some atheists have contentions over this, when certain Christians say the Bible was fundamental to the formation of the United States, others say no, because the separation of church and state, it's a republic with a direct democracy, not a theocracy, therefore these secular values are superior, which we're not going to get into that type of an argument, but you can definitely meet in the middle ground and say that indeed religion was important. I mean, just the fact that Thomas Jefferson decided to do fasting and prayer is very unique, and engaging the followers, so it wasn't just engaging the logic, right? So religion has more emotion than logic, and atheism, one could contend that it has more logic and less emotion. Kind of like the Spock robotic thing, right? But that's a whole nother argument. For Jefferson, the decision to base a revolutionary appeal on religious grounds was expedient, reflecting more an understanding of politics than a belief that the Lord God of hosts was about to intervene in British America. Though not a conventional Christian, Jefferson appreciated the power of spiritual appeals. To frame an anti-British argument in the language of faith took the rhetorical fight to the enemy in a way that was difficult to combat. Jefferson and his colleagues could argue that they were only humbling themselves before the Lord, calling on a largely religious populace to fast and pray, not to resist authority. The wording itself came after Jefferson and his comrades rummaged through Rushworth's collection of revolutionary precedents and the forms of Puritans of that day. The Puritans were intense people. I'm glad I did not have to live under their oppression. Very fanatical people. Very fanatical. In Jefferson's telling, his groups cooked up a resolution on Monday, May 23, 1774. It asked Virginians to pray for deliverance from the evils of civil war. To pray for deliverance for the evils of civil war. Civil war is kind of quite evil when you think about it, because your homeland is not safe. When it's an enemy outside, you can kind of unify and go at it, right? But when you have this hotbed of contention within your own property, it is definitely more anxious, right? Definitely causes more ills, doesn't it? The House of Burgess, meanwhile, considered joining a full boycott of all British goods. See, boycotts are a very powerful way to bring an oppressive, authoritarian, fascistic, corporatocracy, you name it, to its knees, because most of those empires value money above human lives, so they don't care how many people die within their empire, it's about the money, right? And if an evil empire has enough people to spare, they don't really care, right? Yeah, lead those lambs to the slaughter, but you start attacking their wallets, they seem to care. So I think that's like a principle of warfare that can be found throughout many different time periods, and especially today. That's why it should never be illegal to boycott, divest, such and such from any country. at least for individuals, that is, right? And supporting calls for a continental congress, reading the messages from the north and feeling the anxiety in the city. The colonial leadership in Williamsburg was aware of the stakes. A reckoning could not be far off. Indeed, the reckoning. The reckoning. Monticello's cherries had ripened in the interval between Jefferson's departure for Williamsburg in May and his return to Albemarle County by July. He was home to do business. In a letter to their constituents, he and John Walker announced the day of fasting and prayer, a reaction, they wrote, to the dangers impending over British America from the hostile invasion of a sister colony. Hostile invasion from a sister colony. Their language was martial and grave, echoing the Burgess Resolution. He and Walker argued there was a threat of civil war. To execute this strategy, Jefferson turned to his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay, the clergyman who had buried Jefferson's sister Elizabeth after she drowned earlier in the year. It's interesting how he had a kind of an elder. It's a clergyman, but he had an elder, somebody who he could go to give him spiritual advice. And spiritual advice is different than scientific advice. And practical advice is different than spiritual advice as well, right? It's almost like in order to be a good, effective leader, you need a balance of both. Clay was to preach the sermon in the parish of St. Anne's in the new church on the Hardware River. Hardware River, that's a cool name. The location itself was chosen to make the greatest impression, for it was the place thought the most centrical to the parishioners in general. Well, to preach, yes, where you're going to preach, your backdrop is really important. The angle, the shot, the architecture adds kind of energy to the overall vibe of your speech. And how well that energy you create is going to transfer around your audience and then reflect and bounce back onto you, energizing you more, giving you even more better speech. So I can see why they would analyze the centrical part of it. Services were held on different days in different counties. The St. Anne ceremony fell on Saturday, July 23rd, 1775. Jefferson was struck by the human element of experience, writing, "The people met generally with anxiety and alarm in their countenances, and the effect of the days through the whole colony was like a shock of electricity." Yeah, exactly. Arousing every man and placing him erect and solidly in her center. So, an awakening, pretty much. Erect, solid, in the center. 3 days later, the freeholders of Albemarle gathered at the courthouse in Charlottesville to elect Jefferson and Walker to the special August meeting in Williamsburg. The voters also adopted the resolutions of the freeholders of Albemarle County. Freeholders of Albemarle County. That denounced the Boston Port Act. Okay, Boston Port Act. Composed by Jefferson. The resolution spoke of the common rights of mankind. Look at that. The common rights of mankind. So it's surpassing political party, right? Surpassing nation borders. Common rights of humans, our species. Promising we will ever be ready to join with our fellow subjects in exerting all those rightful powers which God has given us, for the re-establishing and guaranteeing such their constitutional rights when, where, and by whomsoever invaded. They called for an immediate ban on British imports, and set a more distant date, October 1st, 1775, 15 months away, for an end to exports unless American grievances were redressed. I wish people would do that today. I really do. Every nation's ills and economic undercutting should be held accountable And if you're importing from an evil empire, you should cut it off and bring your manufacturing back. And you should not be a slave to anyone's imports. And you should never be too unwilling to cut off imports, right? Interesting. A lot we can learn from the past. A lot we can learn. That's why it's very beneficial to read a lot and to analyze and think. Wow. Beautiful.